My name is Arthur Hale. I am 80 years old, and until recently, I still remembered how to tie my own tie, balance a checkbook in my head, and quote Shakespeare's sonnets from memory. Not because I tried to impress anyone, but because I taught them for 42 years in the same small-town high school in Ohio. I was the man generations of students called Mr. Hale. Even long after graduation, the one who told them to believe in their minds and their ability to change the world with words. When my wife Margaret passed away 5 years ago, something essential in me went silent. She was my anchor, my reference point, the one who could look at me and immediately tell when something was wrong. I remember the day she died as if it happened this morning. The coffee pot halfway full, her knitting lying in a pool of sunlight by the armchair, a scarf unfinished. Since then, the house has felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't offer peace but presses in on you like a question you can't answer. My days began to dissolve into rituals. Toast and marmalade at precisely 7:30. The New York Times crossword in ink, a walk around the block if the weather was kind, and maybe a call to one of the few friends I had left, those not yet taken by illness. Relocation or forgetfulness. And my children, well, they were not absent exactly, but they were distant in a way that feels worse. My son Larry lives in Columbus and calls me every Sunday for 5 minutes, sounding like he's waiting for a commercial break to end. My daughter Paula, a financial planner with impeccable suits and a stainless steel voice, visits me once a month, always with some agenda. The last time, she arrived with a stack of papers and a strained smile, speaking in euphemisms. "Dad, let's simplify your life," she said. "You don't need to worry about these little things anymore. Let us take care of it. You've earned the right to relax." But her eyes didn't smile. They scanned the living room like she was evaluating property. I noticed little things changing. My mail began to come opened. Paula started handling my prescriptions, insisting I switch pharmacies to one she preferred. My car keys went missing for 2 days, only to be found under the couch, where I never leave anything. The computer was password-locked one morning, the screen flashing a cheerful blue login I had never created. When I asked her about it, Paula laughed a little too hard and said, "Oh, Daddy, you probably just forgot." That's the phrase that's been clinging to everything lately. You probably just forgot. The last straw came when I went to the bank to withdraw some money for repairs on the old porch steps. The teller, a woman I'd known for years, looked at me with unusual concern and said, "Mr. Hale, are you sure you want to do that? Your daughter said you might be confused these days." Confused? I was stunned into silence. That night I lay in bed for hours, my fingers gripping the sheets, trying to remember whether I had done something recently to suggest I was losing my grip. Had I left the stove on? Forgotten an appointment? Misplaced an envelope? I couldn't find a single error. Not one, but the doubt had already planted itself like mold between the floorboards of my mind. The worst part of aging isn't the physical decline. It's watching the people you love look at you like you're fading, even when you know you're still here. I began to dread Paula's visits, even though a part of me still hoped she might surprise me with affection. But instead of warmth, I got efficiency. Her conversations were filled with, "You should," "It's time," and "We've decided." Somewhere along the line, my daughter stopped treating me like a person and started treating me like a liability. And then came the suggestion, no, the plan, clearly already in motion, that I move into a care home. "It's not a nursing home," Paula explained, showing me glossy brochures full of smiling silver-haired people playing chess and painting landscapes. "It's independent living with support. You'll be safer. You'll have company. It'll be good for you." But I knew what it meant. It meant removal. It meant out of sight, out of mind. It meant no access to the accounts, the keys, the decisions. It meant that my life, or what remained of it, would be reduced to a room with pastel wallpaper and scheduled activities. I politely declined, and she didn't press. But I knew then what I hadn't dared admit before. They were trying to take control. I tried to talk to Larry, hoping he might see it differently. We were close once, or at least I thought we were. He used to write poems as a teenager, which he never showed to anyone but me. But on the phone, when I mentioned my concerns, he chuckled nervously and said, "Dad, you're overthinking it. Paula's just trying to help. Let her." Then he told me about his promotion and his son's soccer game, and by the time we hung up, I felt smaller than I had in years. That night, sitting in my old leather chair, surrounded by photographs of a life I'd lived with full presence, I opened the worn folder where I kept the few things Margaret had told me never to forget. One of them was a note, handwritten in her meticulous cursive, "Bank account, 1992, under Hale Rutherford." Rutherford was her maiden name. It was the name we used, half-jokingly, when we wanted to keep things private from the children. That account, if it still existed, was never tied to any of the main finances. It had been our emergency fund, our shared secret, untouched for decades. And just like that, the weight lifted. Because even as my children tried to paint me as a forgetful old man, I'd remembered the one thing they didn't know existed. I hadn't forgotten everything. I'd remembered the one thing that mattered. It was a Wednesday morning when the mask slipped. I remember it clearly, not because anything dramatic happened at first, but because of how normal it all seemed. Paula had come over, unannounced as usual, with a tote bag full of neatly organized envelopes and a tablet under her arm. She moved through my house like she owned it, turning off the television, straightening the curtains, and sighing at the state of the kitchen counter. "Daddy, you've left your cereal out again. That's not good for the ants," she said, more to herself than to me, as she began rearranging my cabinets. I let her talk, let her wipe down the surfaces I'd already cleaned that morning, let her set up her little mobile command center at the dining room table. I had long since learned that arguing with her only accelerated whatever decisions she had already made in her mind. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the way sunlight passed through the blinds, tracing golden slats on the floor. After about half an hour of silence, broken only by the soft clicks of her tablet and the crinkling of plastic folders, I rose to make tea. That's when I heard it. Paula's voice, low and clipped, speaking into her phone just beyond the archway in the dining room. I couldn't make out the beginning of the conversation, but then I heard her say, "He still thinks he's managing everything. No, he doesn't remember the forms. It's better that way. We just have to keep him calm until we transition the rest. The lawyer said it'll be finalized within the month." There was a pause, and then she added with a short laugh, "He can barely remember what day it is. As long as he doesn't find out about the other account, we're fine." I stood frozen in the kitchen, one hand on the kettle, the other clutching a chipped mug Margaret had once given me on Father's Day. I held my breath. I knew I wasn't supposed to hear that. I wasn't supposed to understand it, but I did. Every word, every cruel implication. Paula thought I was gone, if not physically, then cognitively. And she was acting on that belief, not with concern or compassion, but with calculation. The forms she mentioned were likely the ones she'd had me sign under the pretense of simplifying my life. The transition she referred to, I could only assume that meant the movement of funds or perhaps control of my estate. And then, the other account. That phrase struck like lightning through my memory, illuminating the corners I'd left untouched for decades. She didn't know. She didn't know about the secret account Margaret and I had opened in 1992, the one we maintained quietly, methodically, depositing modest sums here and there, sometimes in cash, sometimes in checks written from our private tutoring jobs or tax. Refunds we didn't need for the moment. We had kept it under the name Hale Rutherford, a nod to her maiden name, but more than that, a deliberate shield. In case of emergencies, she used to say, in case life decides to turn sideways, always keep something that only we know. That account had lain dormant in my mind, like a sealed envelope at the bottom of a drawer, until that moment in the kitchen. I didn't confront her. I didn't burst into the dining room and accuse her of deceit. I knew better. Instead, I returned to my chair, sat down quietly, and waited for her to finish her call. When she reappeared in the room, her expression was composed, pleasant, the way one smiles at a child who mustn't know the real reason the grown-ups are whispering. "Tea?" she asked, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. "No, thank you," I replied calmly. "I think I'll just rest my eyes a bit." She took that as a cue to pack up her things, offering a quick peck on the forehead and a "call me if you need anything." When she left, I waited until the car engine faded down the street, then stood up in hers, walked directly to the hallway closet. I pulled down the old fireproof box from the top shelf, a weighty, dust-covered container that had lived there untouched for at least 10 years. Inside were folded letters, tax forms, and a small black ledger with Margaret's handwriting. "Hale Rutherford account," the label read. I flipped through it, seeing deposits as far back as 1992. The last entry dated nearly 4 years ago. $250 from a tutoring check I'd done quietly after retirement. I felt a strange mixture of guilt and relief. We had never touched that money. We had never needed to. But now, its existence was a lifeline, a private affirmation that I wasn't as powerless as my daughter assumed. The next morning, I called the bank. I gave the name, the approximate balance, and my identification. After a pause, the woman on the phone confirmed that the account was still active and that my name matched the account holder's profile. She asked if I wanted a new card or online access reactivated. "No," I said. "Just send a statement by mail. No electronic trace." She hesitated, then agreed. I hung up and sat in the quiet house, staring at the beige walls and the dust motes spinning in the sunlight. Everything had changed. Paula's deception had peeled away the last remnants of trust. It wasn't just a matter of control over money. It was about identity, about autonomy, about whether I still had the right to decide what happened to me. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just neglect. This was erasure. She wasn't waiting for me to fade. She was helping me disappear, quietly, conveniently, under the guise of care. But I hadn't disappeared. I hadn't forgotten. I remembered the smell of Margaret's garden in spring, the long drives we used to take through Appalachia, the poems Larry used to write, and the way Paula used to cling to my leg when she was scared of thunderstorms. I remembered who I was, what I'd done, and what I had left. Most importantly, I remembered that account, one thread they hadn't managed to cut. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the dining room table with Margaret's ledger, my own checkbooks, and the folder Paula had left behind. I studied everything, the signatures, the legal jargon, the clauses marked with sticky notes. It became clear to me that my children had slowly built a case, a narrative, that I was no longer capable. They were consolidating access, reducing my voice to whispers. But now I had a reason to speak loudly. I had something to protect. As I turned off the lamp and prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. A flicker of resolve, quiet but unmistakable. I knew now that the ground beneath my feet wasn't as solid as I had once believed. That trust given blindly could be used as a weapon, and that family love, as much as it pains me to say, could sometimes curdle into something selfish, cold and calculating. But I also knew that I still had time. I still had memory, and I still had the will to act. They thought I had forgotten everything. But I hadn't. I'd remembered the one thing they didn't know I knew. And that changed everything. The days that followed my discovery unfolded with a strange quietude, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I moved through my routines. Tea at sunrise, the creaking of the floorboards under my slippers, the slow rhythm of brushing my teeth and counting my pills. Not because I had to, but because I needed to preserve something familiar in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. My thoughts, however, were far from settled. Each passing hour brought fresh clarity to what had been happening around me for the past several months, a slow and subtle erosion of my independence, disguised as kindness, masked behind smiles that now seemed more like veils than mirrors. I had not noticed it immediately, and I suppose that was the point. That's how betrayal works when it comes from those you love. It doesn't strike like lightning. It leaks like gas, filling the room with something invisible until the moment of ignition. 3 days after Paula's visit, I received a call from a man who introduced himself as Gregory Fuchs, an elder care coordinator recommended by my daughter. He spoke in a tone that was both professional and suffocatingly cheerful, using phrases like holistic well-being and support transition services. I asked him how he got my number, and he chuckled as if I were a delightful child. "Your daughter, sir. She said you might need a little help organizing your affairs and exploring options for assisted living that would suit your lifestyle. We understand how difficult it can be to make these decisions alone at your age." My age. Those 2 words now echoed like a curse. I thanked him and hung up without further comment, then immediately called Paula. She didn't pick up. I tried again. Nothing. That afternoon, an envelope was slid into my mailbox. No return address, just my name handwritten in a tidy, practiced script. Inside were more brochures, glossy and upbeat, showing silver-haired men playing golf, smiling at watercolor classes, posing with therapy dogs. I stared at them as if they were cartoons, caricatures of what life was supposed to be like for people like me. Muted, managed, medicated. I went upstairs and unlocked the drawer where I kept my personal documents. The living trust Margaret and I had established years ago was gone. In its place was a new folder labeled Revised Financial Plan, full of pages bearing my name, some of them signed by me, though I could not recall the occasion. It dawned on me with a slow, sinking dread that these papers had been slipped under my nose during those visits when Paula would bring just a few things to look over. Her voice honeyed with encouragement, her presence so commanding that I had stopped questioning. I remembered her saying, "It's just paperwork for tax season," or "You don't want to deal with the IRS on your own, do you?" I had trusted her. I had been naive. In the following days, a series of small humiliations began to unfold, each one wearing the face of concern. Larry called and offered to come visit, not just to see me, but, as he put it, to assess the situation. He used the phrase as though I were a faulty appliance. When he arrived, his eyes scanned the house like an inspector. "You're still using the same stove, Dad?" he asked. "And you're not checking the smoke detectors?" I told him I had changed the batteries last month. He didn't respond. Instead, he handed me a new pill organizer, the kind with brightly colored boxes labeled by day and time. "Just to make things easier," he said, before launching into a speech about how much strain I was under. "I know you don't want to admit it, but being alone like this, it's not sustainable. What if you fall? What if you forget the oven? What if you wander out and can't find your way back?" I stared at him, dumbfounded. I had lived in this house longer than he had ever lived anywhere. I knew every creak of the floor, every light switch, every branch in the backyard oak tree. "Do you know what unsustainable is, Larry?" I finally said. "Being treated like a danger to myself when I've raised 2 children and buried a wife and still remember how to write in cursive." He didn't reply. He left a few hours later, saying, "We'll talk soon." in a tone that promised more decisions made in rooms I would not be invited into. A week later, my cable was disconnected. I called the provider, and they said the request had been made by legal proxy with full documentation. I asked for the name. They said Paula. When I called her, she answered immediately, cheerful as ever. "Daddy, how are you?" I told her the television didn't work. "Oh," she said, "I thought it might be time to take a break from screens. They can be so overstimulating." I asked her under what authority she had made that decision. "We just want you to focus on your health. You've been spending too much time alone, and watching the news all day isn't good for your blood pressure. It's for your own good." That phrase, "for your own good," was becoming a refrain, a kind of weapon. It was used to disguise theft as kindness, control as care. The final blow came one afternoon when I visited the bank to withdraw some cash. I'd made a habit of going in person, both to stretch my legs and to keep human contact in my life. But that day, the teller looked at me differently. "Mr. Hale, your access to this account has been limited. There's a note here from your authorized co-signer requesting monitoring." I blinked at her. "What co-signer?" She pulled up the file. "Your daughter, Paula Hale. She submitted the paperwork last month." I asked to see it. She couldn't show me without manager approval. I waited in a plastic chair for 27 minutes while a young man in a blazer made some calls and finally confirmed that yes, I had signed a durable power of attorney. I asked for a copy. He hesitated, then handed it to me in a manila envelope. My signature was there, unmistakable. But the date was during a week when I had been sick with the flu, barely out of bed, and certainly not coherent enough to understand legal documents. And yet, there it was, my name, binding and permanent. I left the bank not with cash, but with that envelope heavy in my coat pocket. Back home, I sat at the dining room table and stared at the signed papers. I remembered Paula's visit that week. Remembered her saying, "Just sign here so I can reorder your prescriptions online," and handing me a clipboard. She had handed me a pen. She had distracted me with a question about Margaret's birthday, and I had trusted her. I felt the walls of the house close in. I felt the air thicken. I was not losing my mind. I was losing my place in my own life. They were taking it from me, one form, one phone call, one subtle erasure at a time. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that I was still here. I still had the ledger. I still had the other account. And I was still watching, quietly, carefully, waiting for the moment when I would no longer be patient. I had not been to the downtown branch of Glenhaven Trust in nearly 15 years, not since Margaret and I opened our last joint savings account to set aside a modest fund for Hazel and Reginald's future education. Walking into that building now felt like re-entering a past life, but the air was still the same, a mixture of waxed tile, coffee from the employee break room, and old carpet. I walked slowly to the front desk and asked to speak with someone who handled legacy accounts. The receptionist, a woman with frosted blonde hair and a cautious smile, asked me to wait while she made a call. "Someone will be with you shortly, Mr. Hale," she said. I nodded and sat down, trying not to fidget with the envelope tucked under my arm, the original ledger and identification for the Hale Rutherford account. 10 minutes later, I was greeted by a tall woman in her early 50s wearing tortoiseshell glasses and a slate-gray blazer. "Mr. Hale, I'm Eleanor Fitzsimmons, Vice President of Client Services. Why don't you come with me?" Her voice was calm but efficient, like someone who had guided many people through complex financial terrain and no longer needed to use small talk as a prelude to business. Her office was neat and sunlit, with framed certificates and a small sculpture of a bird made of polished stone. I handed her the documents and explained that I wanted to confirm the status and recent activity on the Hale Rutherford account, under Margaret's maiden name. She took the paperwork and began entering the numbers into her system. Her face remained neutral, but I noticed a slight raise of the eyebrows. "Yes, Mr. Hale," she said, scanning the screen. "The account is active. Balance is currently $184,617. There have been no withdrawals since 2009, but we have continued to credit interest. The account was flagged as dormant due to inactivity, but not closed. You are still listed as the sole account holder." I felt something stir inside me. Gratitude, vindication, perhaps even a fragile kind of hope. "I'd like to make a withdrawal today," I said, "and I'd also like to discuss moving the funds under a new configuration, something more protected." She looked at me carefully. "Are you currently under any form of guardianship or legal oversight?" I held her gaze. "No, but someone is trying very hard to make it look that way. I need to get ahead of them." I expected skepticism, maybe even condescension, but what I got instead was a small, sharp nod. She pushed her chair back. "I'll be right back with the paperwork." An hour later, I walked out of the bank with a cashier's check for $20,000, and the remainder scheduled for transfer to a private certificate of deposit under my name only, set to mature in a year with high withdrawal penalties. Just as importantly, all account notifications would be paper-based and addressed exclusively to a P.O. box I'd set up that morning. No emails, no phone calls, no digital footprint. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt an unfamiliar strength in my step, as if the act of reclaiming this forgotten part of my life had reassembled a spine that had been slowly dissolving under the weight of a helplessness. I used a portion of the withdrawn funds to schedule a consultation with an attorney, a man named Julian Carr, whose office was 2 blocks from the courthouse and who had once been one of my students, though I doubted he remembered me. His receptionist was polite, and his waiting room smelled of pine and printer toner. When Julian entered, he looked at me and said, "Mr. Hale, Arthur Hale." There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes and then a smile. "You gave me a C- in Senior Lit because I refused to read Hardy. I never forgot that." I smiled faintly. "And look at you now." The bar clearly didn't mind. He gestured toward his office, and we began. For 2 hours, I laid it all out. Not just the bank account, but the power of attorney, the documents I'd been asked to sign under false pretenses, the sudden concern about my memory, the coordination between my children, and the mounting evidence that they were preparing to move me into a facility and assume full financial control. Julian listened without interrupting, taking notes by hand in tight, efficient strokes. When I was done, he leaned back and said, "This isn't just unethical. Depending on how far they've gone, it may be actionable." He explained that the power of attorney could be challenged if signed under duress or without informed consent. The account activity, the guardianship pressure, even the withheld mail, each was a piece of a mosaic that painted a picture of exploitation. "You're not incompetent, Mr. Hale," he said. "You're being isolated. That's not the same thing." I nodded. "Can we fight it?" He smiled. "We can do more than fight it. We can flip the script, but you need to stay quiet. No warnings, no confrontations. Let them keep thinking you're asleep at the wheel." That night, back at the house, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old wall clock, and the occasional gust of wind against the windows. My children, my own flesh and blood, had begun to erase me, not out of malice, I realized, but out of convenience. I was no longer a father to them. I was a risk, an unpredictable asset with a beating heart and too many opinions. I felt the sorrow of that truth curl around me like smoke, but I also felt something harder rising beneath it. Resolve, sharpened by betrayal. They had misjudged me, They thought I'd forgotten everything. But I remembered the truth, and now I had the means to act on it. This, I knew, was the turning point. Not the end of the story, but the end of my silence. The weeks that followed moved with deceptive calm, the sort of stillness that hangs before a thunderstorm when even the birds fall silent and the air thickens with something unseen. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged. Paula called once a week, asking overly cheerful questions about my health, whether I'd eaten, how I was sleeping, what the doctor had said, though I hadn't been to the doctor in over 4 months. Larry sent me emails filled with helpful resources about aging gracefully, including links to articles about elder care homes and cognitive decline. I replied to none of them. I had learned by now that silence, used correctly, can be more effective than any argument. But under that veneer of normalcy, I was working. Quietly, deliberately, and with growing precision. Julian, my attorney, had begun the slow and meticulous process of unraveling the legal web that my children had constructed. He filed a motion to revoke the durable power of attorney, citing coercion, and submitted affidavits of competency signed by 2 local physicians I had visited independently and voluntarily. He also began reviewing my real estate documents, tax filings, and any asset transfers from the past 2 years, digging for patterns, for signatures that didn't quite match, for clauses inserted in fine print that might indicate undue influence. Each time we met, he seemed both more appalled and more energized. "They've been planning this for a while," he said once, tapping his pen on a highlighted paragraph. "But they got lazy. They relied on your trust to cover their tracks." Meanwhile, I paid a private investigator, an old acquaintance of Julian's named Marcus Bell, to find out just how far Paula and Larry had gone. What Marcus uncovered peeled away the last shreds of illusion I'd clung to. Several months ago, Paula had filed preliminary paperwork to list me as functionally dependent in her insurance company's internal care registry, a designation used to justify financial oversight or trigger legal processes involving guardianship. Larry had co-signed a letter written in a tone of grave concern, suggesting that I had difficulty recalling basic information and had begun wandering at night. I stared at those words, feeling something in me rupture, not from disbelief, but from recognition. They had not simply misunderstood me, they had actively rewritten me, painting me as a man who no longer knew his own name. Worse yet, Marcus found that Paula had recently approached a real estate agent under the guise of preparing my house for transition to long-term care, claiming she had the authority to initiate a valuation and quietly asking what kind of sale could be arranged if the owner is uncooperative. It was all there in emails, politely worded but unmistakably predatory. When Julian saw the documentation, he sat back in his chair and whistled low. "This isn't just a family dispute anymore," he said. "This is financial elder abuse, and it's provable." But he also warned me, this will escalate. Once they realize you've taken action, they'll respond, and not gently. Are you ready for that? I wasn't sure what ready meant anymore, but I nodded. Because what they had already taken, the dignity, the trust, the quiet pride of a life lived with self-direction, was not something I was willing to lose twice. 2 weeks later, it began. First came the unannounced visit. I had just finished lunch and was washing a plate when I heard the knock, a sharp, impatient rhythm that made the dog across the street start barking. I opened the door to find Paula and Larry standing there, arms crossed, faces tight with forced smiles. "Daddy," Paula said, stepping forward. "We were in town and thought we'd stop by. You haven't been answering our messages." I let them in, wordlessly, and watched as they surveyed the living room like surveyors evaluating a condemned structure. Larry perched on the arm of the couch, arms crossed. Paula stood with her purse still slung over her shoulder, tapping her fingers against the leather strap. "We're worried about you," Larry began. "You've been acting withdrawn, not yourself." I sat in the armchair opposite them and folded my hands. "I've been busy," I said. Paula tilted her head, the way she used to do when I corrected her grammar as a child. "Busy with what, Daddy?" she asked. "You're not driving anymore. You haven't seen your primary doctor. You cancelled your follow-up with Dr. Yates. That's not like you." I didn't respond. I watched her eyes scan the table, the bookshelf, the notepad beside the telephone. "You've made some financial transactions lately," she added, as if casually. "Significant ones. Withdrawals. Transfers. We were notified." That was the moment I understood the extent of their reach. They had enrolled themselves as emergency contacts on some of my accounts and, through their corporate connections, flagged me internally. Privacy meant little when the foxes were guarding the henhouse. I took a breath. "Everything I've done is legal, and none of it concerns you anymore." Paula's smile cracked, just slightly. "We're your children," she said. "It concerns us very much." Larry leaned forward. "Dad, be honest with us. Are you being manipulated? Is someone influencing your decisions? Because it doesn't make sense. You're changing things, closing access, moving money around, taking control," I interrupted. "I'm taking control. Something you two seem to find threatening." Silence fell. Paula looked at Larry, then back at me. "We want you to get an evaluation," she said finally. "A professional one, cognitive and psychological, just to put our minds at ease." I stared at her. "You mean the evaluation you already submitted forged documents for?" Her face froze. "We know about that. Julian has the paperwork. So does the court. You'll be hearing from them soon." Larry stood. "You're making a mistake, Dad," he said, anger blooming under his voice. "You're listening to the wrong people. We've been trying to help you." I stood too. "You've been helping yourselves, and you're angry because the story you've been telling about the doddering old man who needs saving isn't holding up." They left not long after, Paula's footsteps sharp against the tile. Before closing the door, she turned to me and said, "You're going to regret this, Daddy, when you're alone, when no one's there." I didn't reply. I just watched them walk to the car, their silhouettes stiff with fury. That night, my house was egged. Just 2 shells cracked against the front window and the mailbox. Juvenile, cowardly, but a message all the same. The next morning, the porch light was shattered. I documented everything. I sent it to Julian. He advised me to install security cameras and notify the authorities, which I did, although the officer who arrived was young and distracted and made vague remarks about kids these days. Still, it was a record. Another thread in the growing tapestry of retaliation. And I kept going. I changed the locks. I updated my will. I moved the rest of the funds from the joint account Paula had once managed into a separate trust, inaccessible to anyone but me. I retained a financial advisor, a woman named Ruth who met me in a public cafe and never asked unnecessary questions. And I kept Marcus on retainer, just in case. Every morning, I woke up with purpose. I made my own breakfast. I read the paper. I stretched. And then I worked. On my life, on my freedom, on the version of myself that refused to be erased. Paula and Larry did what I expected. They filed an emergency petition for guardianship, citing increasing paranoia, erratic behavior, and financial endangerment. Julian responded with documentation, medical records, surveillance footage, and deposition offers from neighbors, physicians, and community members who had spoken with me regularly. The court date was set. I would have to sit across from my children and prove that I was still myself. And I would do it, not just to keep my house, my name, or my accounts, but because if I didn't, everything Margaret and I had built together would be lost to people who believed that age equals absence, that gray hair means surrender, that memory is a weakness. They had counted on my silence, but I had remembered everything. That made me dangerous. The day of the court hearing arrived like a cold, grey dawn, heavy with anticipation and the weight of unspoken fears. I woke early, unable to sleep, the thin rays of morning light cutting across the worn carpet of my living room. Every familiar sound, the ticking clock, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional chirp of birds outside, seemed amplified, as if the world itself was holding its breath alongside me. Julian arrived promptly, his briefcase in hand and a calm determination in his eyes that I desperately needed to borrow. He reviewed the stack of documents one last time, reassured me with a firm handshake, and reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight. "We have truth, and we have the law," he said quietly. "They may have the anger, but we have the facts." As we drove to the courthouse, I kept my gaze fixed out the window, tracing the familiar streets I'd walked so many times before, but now saw through a new lens, one stained with the bitter taste of betrayal. The courthouse itself was a looming structure of stone and glass, its steps worn by decades of people entering and leaving with heavy hearts and uncertain futures. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and polished wood, and the murmurs of legal proceedings echoed softly through the hallways. We waited in a sterile conference room, the minutes stretching like shadows, until finally the bailiff appeared and announced it was time. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension, punctuated only by the shuffling of papers and the low murmur of voices as people settled into their seats. I saw my children immediately. Paula sitting stiffly beside Larry, their expressions taut and guarded, as if preparing for a battle they had rehearsed 1,000 times. The judge was an elderly woman with sharp eyes behind rimless glasses, her presence commanding but not unkind. She looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and caution, the weight of her office settling over us all like a tangible force. Julian began by presenting evidence of my competency. Medical evaluations from neurologists and psychiatrists, statements from neighbors and friends affirming my daily functioning, and financial records that traced every transaction with clarity and responsibility. He spoke calmly, but with passion, emphasizing the importance of preserving the dignity and autonomy of an individual who was fully capable of making decisions about his own life. "Mr. Hale is not a danger to himself," Julian said firmly. "He is not incapacitated. What we are witnessing here is a misguided attempt to seize control under the guise of concern." Then it was my turn. The judge asked me simple questions at first. My name, my date of birth, the day of the week, and I answered with clarity. She inquired about my daily routines, my social interactions, and my understanding of financial matters. I spoke about the secret account Margaret and I had opened, about my recent efforts to protect my assets, and about the growing sense that those closest to me had been working against my interests. My voice wavered at times, but my resolve remained unbroken. "I may be old," I said, "but I am not powerless. I remember everything that matters. And I will not let my life be taken from me by those who believe my age is an excuse for their greed." Paula's attorney then presented their case, painting a starkly different picture. They spoke of memory lapses and confusion, citing isolated incidents where I had misplaced keys or forgotten appointments. They played a video, grainy and disjointed, showing me struggling to recall names and dates during a visit to the doctor. The court watched in silence as my competence was called into question, my very identity reduced to a collection of moments carefully selected to portray decline. But I held my head high, knowing that those moments were neither the whole story nor the truth. The judge asked me directly if I needed help managing my finances or living arrangements. I answered honestly. I welcomed support when needed, but I would never surrender my autonomy or my right to make decisions. I spoke about the importance of respect, of trust, and of love that does not seek to control, but to empower. I am not the same man I was 40 years ago, I said, but I am still myself, and that is enough. After hours that felt like days, the judge retired to consider her ruling. Julian and I sat in the empty courtroom, the echoes of voices and footsteps fading into a heavy silence. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, a mixture of fear, hope, and exhaustion. Finally, the doors opened and the judge returned, her expression unreadable but steady. She spoke slowly, her words deliberate and clear. After careful review of all evidence and testimonies, she began, "This court finds that Arthur Hale is competent to manage his own affairs and make decisions regarding his personal and financial matters. The petition for guardianship is denied." Relief surged through me like a sudden wind, shaking the dust from years of doubt and pain. My children's faces fell, a mixture of shock and anger flickering across their features. The judge continued, "Furthermore, any actions taken under the power of attorney granted during periods of incapacitation must be reviewed and, if found to have been executed without full consent or under coercion, may be subject to reversal." Julian nodded, standing to thank the court, while I simply sat back, letting the words wash over me. I thought of Margaret and the life we had built, of the quiet strength that had carried me this far, and of the truth I had held on to when others tried to bury it. For the first time in many months, I felt free, not just in body, but in spirit. Walking out of the courthouse, the sky was a bright, unbroken blue. The air felt fresher, lighter. I knew the battles ahead would not be easy. There would be appeals, there would be attempts to wear me down. But I was ready. I had fought for my dignity, reclaimed my voice, and reminded my family and myself that age does not erase a man's soul. I was not alone, and I was not forgotten. The secret account, the lawyer, the memories, they were all pieces of a larger mosaic, one that told the story of a man who refused to be erased. And as I stepped into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on my face, I knew this was not the end. It was a beginning. The months that followed the court's decision passed not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet recalibration, like the slow settling of a building after an earthquake. There was no grand celebration, no moment of public vindication, just the slow, deliberate restoration of a life that had nearly been taken from me under the guise of concern. I returned to my house, not as the frail, confused man my children had tried to portray, but as its rightful and conscious steward. And yet, the space felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I saw it all with new eyes. Every object, every book on the shelf, every framed photograph held the weight of what had almost been lost. I moved through the rooms not as a tenant of my own life, but as someone who had fought to remain present in it, who had chosen not to slip silently into the role of a shadow. I did not hear from Paula or Larry for several weeks after the hearing. There were no calls, no emails, no apologies. I imagined them licking their wounds, recalculating, perhaps even searching for new strategies. But I had closed the doors through which they once entered. The power of attorney was revoked. The joint accounts were dissolved. The house deed, once quietly altered, was now secured in my name alone. I had rewritten the narrative they had tried to impose on me, not just in the eyes of the court, but in the pages of my own sense of self. I had stared down the suggestion that I was no longer capable, and I'd walked away with proof, not for them, but for me, that I still held the pen. One afternoon in early spring, when the first daffodils had begun to poke through the thawing soil, I received a letter. It was handwritten, addressed simply to Dad, and the envelope carried Paula's neat, mechanical handwriting. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I wanted to read what she might say. Inside was a single page, written in blue ink on heavy cream paper. "Daddy," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I understand that. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for trying to help you, but for not listening when you said you didn't need saving. I truly believed I was doing the right thing, but I see now that it wasn't right for you. Maybe someday we can talk. Maybe not. I hope you're well. Love, Paula." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. I felt no anger, no joy, just a calm detachment, as though the words had come not from my daughter, but from someone playing the part of a daughter in a story that no longer belonged to her. I did not respond. Instead, I began the quiet work of building a new kind of life, not grand or adventurous, but true. I joined a small book club at the library, where people still cared about ideas and language and the way stories were told. I reconnected with a few old colleagues, men and women who had once shared chalkboards and crowded faculty lounges with me. I even began tutoring again, once a week, a shy teenager named Raphael whose mother had asked for help after school. And slowly, I began to feel useful again, not as a father or a husband, but as a man with something still to give. The money from the Hale Rutherford account remained untouched, save for a modest sum I used to renovate the guest room into a study. I had no desire for luxury or revenge. What I craved was clarity, simplicity, and the peace of knowing that the decisions I made from now on would be entirely my own. I also established a trust, not for my children, but for scholarships to be given in Margaret's name, for students who wanted to study literature, who believed that words mattered. That was her legacy, and now it would be mine. Every evening, I sat in that study by the window, watching the sunset spill across the backyard. I no longer feared the silence. I no longer questioned the stillness of being alone. I had learned that solitude is not the same as abandonment, that dignity is not something others grant you, but something you hold on to when no one is watching. They had tried to write me out of my own life, but I had remembered the line they didn't. The secret account, yes. But more than that, the quiet conviction that I was still here, still whole, still mine. That was the true inheritance. That was what they could never take.